let's begin with this. In a week, next Wednesday, we'll have the midterm exam in this class. We'll do a review session on Monday, and the way we'll do that is just in a standard question and answer format. There won't be a formal stand-up review, and the reason for that is that there will be a narrative review, a written out review, that'll be posted to the course website. The one that's up there now is from the last time I taught this class in 2008. The one that goes up today will actually be updated because the format of the class is a little bit different. So the idea is, take a look at the narrative review before Monday, and if you've still got some questions, we'll deal with them, okay? Rather than have me try to go over half a semester's work in 50 minutes. There's the content of the exam. It's going to cover everything since the first day of class, the introduction and all the other stuff, and the readings. I have not spent a great deal of time on Zerubbabel, I know that, but then again, Zerubbabel doesn't need much time spent. It's a beautifully written book. It's what I call bathtub reading, and it's just kind of all there. I have it there because I want you to see what a perspective on social cognition looks like when it's not written by a psychologist, okay? Somebody who focuses on the individual's internal mental states, and instead take a look at what it looks like from a guy who looks at bigger social structures. There's the format. I haven't finished writing the exam yet, so I don't know exactly what it's going to look like, but it's going to look kind of sort of something like this. There'll be 10 to 15 questions. They'll be worth 3 to 5 points each because I got a sum to 50, okay? And we're going to look for very, very short answers. Just a couple of sentences is going to do. All these questions will have to do with basic concepts and principles. What I want you to get out of this course is a kind of theoretical vocabulary and a knowledge of the research so that you can think for yourself about various topics in social cognition. You'll provide your answers right on the exam itself, so you don't have to go scramble someplace to buy a blue book. And we want you to write your answers in ink. If you do that, we can reconsider your exam. If you do it in pencil, we can't. So that's the story there. And there's lots of stuff available to you for preparation. If you click on the exam information page on the BSpace the website, you'll see first a long disquisition about why I do exams the way I do, the information on the scoring procedures. You'll find a copy of the narrative review that'll be posted by the end of today, and you'll also find all my old exams accompanied by the scoring guides that I give the GSIs to help them score the exams. So you can kind of see what kinds of questions I tend to ask and what kinds of answers I tend to be looking for. Of course, the website also has the lecture illustrations. It has lecture supplements, which give you a different, somewhat expanded perspective on the lectures. And finally, if all of that doesn't take care of your questions, which it might very well not, what you should do is simply post your any additional questions you have to the comments and queries forum on the BSpace website. If you do that, you'll get a response from me or maybe one of the GSIs within a day or so. And the deadline for that is Tuesday, March 16th at noon. If you post your questions by Tuesday at noon, the exam's on Wednesday, I'll guarantee to give you a response by 5 o'clock that day. But after about 5 o'clock, I tend to turn into a pumpkin, and I don't necessarily look at my email or surf the web again until the next morning. So that's the story there. Any quick questions about the content and format of the exam? It's all pretty self-explanatory. I don't expect anybody to get into a conniption about this. Okay. The deep background for the discussion that we've had so far about social judgment and inference is a framework which is sometimes known as the normative model for human rationality. And what that normative model basically assumes is that when people reason about events, when people reason about the things that they experience and the things that happen to them, they follow normative principles of logic. The normative model for human rationality also assumes that people's judgments and decisions and choices are based on a principle of rational self-interest, by which we mean that you try to maximize your gains and you try to minimize your losses, and you try to do all of that as efficiently as possible, okay? That's what rational thought and action is supposed to involve. The covariation calculus for causal attribution and the variants of it that we talked about the last couple of days are really good expressions of normative rationality, because in the covariation calculus, you've got an algorithm that allows you to compute what caused something to occur. All you have to do is to input the necessary information, consensus, consistency, and distinctiveness information, and then there's a little processor, which is called the covariation calculus, and it outputs the proper logical attribution to the actor, to the target, to the context, or to some combination of these kinds of things. And the idea is that if you've got consensus, consistency, and distinctiveness information, if you've already got that information, you've got all the information you need to make a perfectly logical, normatively correct attribution about various kinds of causes. And the general idea behind the normative model for human rationality is that rational thought always is like this, that we always employ these kinds of algorithms where we plug in the required information, and there's a calculus that generates the one correct answer. The nice thing about these kinds of algorithms is that they're guaranteed to reach the correct answer. And if you think about the covariation calculus for a second, given a particular pattern of consensus, consistency, and distinctiveness information, there's really no other attribution you could make except the one that is generated by the calculus itself. Now, last time, what we discussed toward the end of the lecture were some departures from the covariation calculus. The fundamental attribution error, where people tend to make attributions to personal, internal distributions rather than to external, situational factors, regardless of the information that's available to them. The actor-observer difference in causal attribution, which says that we tend to make the fundamental attribution error when making causal attributions about other people's behavior, though when we make causal attributions about our own behavior, we tend to focus on situational factors. And then finally, the self-serving bias in causal attribution, which says that when we explain our own behaviors, we tend to attribute positive outcomes to internal personal factors, and we tend to attribute negative outcomes to external situational factors. And these are all departures from the covariation calculus, and they are therefore all departures from the precepts of normative rationality. There has developed within social psychology especially a whole industry devoted to documenting these kinds of departures from normative rationality, and there are many social psychologists who are persuaded that these are important departures and that they're pervasive. So, for example, Richard Nisbett at the University of Michigan and Lee Ross at Stanford University some time ago wrote a book called Human Inference, Strategies and Shortcomings of Social Judgment, in which they argue that they've identified a number of shortcomings in everyday inference. People's over-reliance on primitive judgmental heuristics or their inattentiveness to conventional normative considerations. This, what's called the Heuristics and Biases Program for the Study of Social Cognition, really begins with Nisbett and Ross's book, which was based largely on the work of Danny Kahneman and Amos Tversky. More recently, Tom Gilovich, a psychologist at Cornell University, has written a kind of a follow-up to the Nisbett and Ross book called How We Know What Isn't So, The Fallibility of Human Reason in Everyday Life, in which he takes an entire book to point out the many questionable and erroneous beliefs that we have that have purely cognitive origins, traced to imperfections in our capacities to process information and draw conclusions, the products of flawed rationality. Joachim Kruger and David Funder, a couple of years ago, produced a list of the biases and errors in human reasoning that have been documented by social psychologists. I only talked about 3 of these: the fundamental attribution error, the self-serving bias in causal attribution, and the actor-observer bias in causal attribution. But you can see you can spend a lifetime documenting these kinds of errors and biases. And in fact, if you do what I did this morning, just for the sheer hell of it, because I had nothing better to do with my life, I suppose, which is to enter cognitive errors into a Google search, you get page after page after page, this exhaustive list of things that go wrong with human reasoning. There is an entire industry devoted to this kind of thing now, an industry which I have come to call the people are stupid school of psychology. Okay? There are a large number of psychologists, chiefly social psychologists, who are devoted to who seem to be devoted to the proposition that people are just not very smart. The people are stupid school of psychology seems to coalesce around about 6 propositions about human judgment and inference. The first of which is that people are fundamentally irrational, that we don't think very hard about what we do, we prefer heuristic shortcuts to more involved algorithms, and we tend to let our emotions and our motives rule our cognition. The second argument is that people are pretty much on automatic pilot most of the time, that we don't pay too much attention to what's going on around us, and that we tend to be swayed by our first impressions and by our immediate responses. This school also tends to argue that our behavior is mostly unconscious, which is to say that most of what we do is a product of automatic processes that are inevitably evoked by features of the situation, and that the reasons we give for our behaviors are little more than post hoc rationalizations. First we act, and then we try to figure out why we did it, instead of having a reason for our action and behaving in accordance with that reason. Those are the 3 central assumptions of stupidism. The people are stupid school of social psychology, but they get elaborated a little bit more by some other members of this school. First, the idea that we don't know what we're doing. There are social psychologists who argue that we really don't have a very good sense of what we feel or what we want. We can't predict our own behavior. We have no idea how we will feel when something happens. One of these investigators, one of these theorists went so far as to point out that when George Bush was elected president of the United States in 2000, large numbers of people said they were going to leave the country, and hardly any of them did. Okay? So, see, there you go. We just have no idea what we're doing and what we're going to what we're going to do. There's a subset. I think it's the 5th grade in this school, which actually argues that unconscious thought is superior to conscious thought. That conscious thought gets in the way of adaptive behavior, and that what we really ought to do is just kind of go with our intuitions and our first impressions, and everything would be fine. And then finally, there's an argument that we're so stupid we don't even know how stupid we are, that we don't appreciate the role that errors and biases play in our judgments, so that we just kind of continue going on and making these mistakes. It's a wonder how, as a species, we have lived so long with all of this. I won't go any further on this because I could spend an entire semester talking about this, and I don't want to because it's painful. But I'll just get rid of this. But the first thing that has to be said is it's not necessarily true. Okay, that people are as stupid as all of that. Let's look first at one of the departures from the covariation calculus that I talked about last time, the self-other difference in causal attribution. The tendency that we tend to make internal attributions, internal personal trait-like attributions for the behavior of other people, whereas we tend to make external situational attributions for our own behavior. Well, let's just assume for a second that that's true, okay? The first thing you want to say is, well, is that really an error? In the first place, you would think that if this self-other difference in causal attribution were really true, that would be a kind of counterweight to the fundamental attribution error. The fundamental attribution error says that the naive psychologist is a trait theorist, always preferring to explain people's behavior in terms of their personality traits instead of in terms of situational influences and other kinds of social influences. But it turns out we don't do that for ourselves, according to the self-other difference in causal attribution. And one of the reasons we don't do that for ourselves is that, apparently, is that we have a lot of information about why we do what we do. When I go outside on a day like this, I might actually carry an umbrella, and even though it's sunny out and all sorts of things like that, and people say, well, he's a very cautious person. No, I'm carrying an umbrella because I read a weather forecast that said it might rain later in the day. So I know why I'm doing it, and it might have something to do with the situation. And the fact of the matter is, other people, we don't have access to that kind of information. We don't know how they're viewing the world. But instead of explaining the difference in causal attribution, let's see if it really actually occurs. Is there a big difference between the way we make causal attributions about our own behavior and the way we make causal attributions about other people's behavior? This research was recently revisited by a psychologist named Bertrand Mallet, who used to be at the University of Oregon. He's now at Brown University, who looked at, I told you it's an industry, 173 studies since the very first one, purportedly documenting the self-other difference in causal attribution. And what he did was to calculate, for each of these studies, a bias score that basically a reflection of the relative weight of personal or internal trait-like attributions. He did it because he's a neurotic extrovert, or situational or external attributions. He did it because his father told him to do it. And then calculate a simple bias score that reflects people's preference for internal versus external attributions. When you plot the results of these 173 studies, what you find is the mean bias score is almost exactly 0, okay? Which means that people don't show an internal-external bias. They just don't do it. Here, for all the studies, the bias score is about as close to 0 as you can get. If you look at what's called standard studies, studies that use the standard paradigms for studying causal attribution, it actually gets worse. So it turns out that 173 studies later, what we thought was so turns out not to be so. There doesn't seem to be very much of a difference between how we make attributions about our own behavior and how we make attributions about other people's behavior. Moreover, when you look at this, at the same data another way, it turns out that there isn't much evidence for a self-serving bias in causal attribution either. Remember that the self-serving bias is an argument that we tend to attribute negative outcomes to situational factors and positive outcomes to our own efforts, calculate the same kind of bias, discriminating between negative events, the dark circles, and positive events, the dark circles, and negative events, the open squares, and you see that the two distributions are right on top of each other. There's very small effect there. It's not a big difference at all. And then when you put all of this together, if you think about it for a second, if there's little or no actor-observer difference, there's really little or no evidence for the fundamental attribution error either, because people make attributions about other people's behavior the same way they make attributions about their own behavior, with a mix of internal and external factors. So it turns out that what we thought was so, and frankly, what you read is so in the Fisk and Taylor book, which I'll remind you is the best book on social cognition available, which is why I assigned it to you. It's not just because they're good friends. It's just not there, okay? Mallet actually plots this very interesting figure showing the magnitude of the self-other difference in causal attribution across time. Here's the very first studies, which actually didn't find much, okay? But the investigators thought they saw it, okay? What then happens is that for the next 4 or 5 years, you get whopping self-other differences in causal attribution appearing in the literature, and then the literature begins to correct itself so that in the most recent literature, the bias actually flips to some extent. Now, there's still not much bias there, but that's basically what happens. There are other examples of this in the social psychological literature where the field gets captured by a really interesting idea or gets captured by a really interesting finding, and it takes the field a long time to kind of work its way out of it and figure out that the original finding wasn't quite right. But as an empirical matter, it turns out that there isn't a self-other difference in causal attribution. There really isn't a tendency to make internal dispositional attributions about even other people's behavior. There is a little bit of self-serving bias. Yes, it's true. If you think about the explanations you give for your own outcomes, when you try to explain to your parents why you got a C in a class, it's always because the teacher was hard or you didn't have time. When you try to explain to your parents why you got an A in a class, you always say, it's because I'm really smart. Yeah, we do that a little bit, but the rest of the errors just don't seem to be there at all. More important, the whole literature, the whole traditional literature on causal attribution seems to be predicated on a fundamental misconception about how people think about the causes of behavior. Remember that the assignment of causality to internal personal factors versus external situational factors allegedly began with Lewin's grand truism that behavior is a function of the person and the environment. What social psychologists did, beginning with Kelly, is to assume that personal factors and environmental factors are independent of each other, okay? But that wasn't Lewin's idea, okay? Lewin's idea was that the person and the environment are interdependent. They are interrelated. They are intertwined with each other. How many more interwords do I have to use to get the point across? That people are part of the environment, okay, and people shape the environment to which they respond. People construct their environments either through their behavior or through their mental activity, and because the person and the environment are interdependent, you can't really partition causes between the person and the environment in the way that the covariation calculus wants you to do, and that the people who talk about the fundamental attribution error and the self-other difference in causal attribution and everything else expects you to do. Here's just one little piece of evidence to remind you of. This is a quote from Lewin himself, okay? The psychological environment has to be regarded functionally as part of one interdependent field, which Lewin called the life space, the other part of which is the person. That this fundamental fact is the keystone of what Lewin called the field theoretical approach. Persons and environments are not separable in the same in the way you might think they are, and that's of course what the doctrine of interactionism is all about. That people construct environments. There may be personal influences on behavior. There may be environmental influences, but people also influence the situations that influence their behavior. And the covariation calculus and the whole discussion of things like the fundamental attribution error doesn't allow for this at all. Okay, doesn't take into account any of this. I'll spare you this, but just to say that that whole long literature seems to be predicated on a fundamentally erroneous or misleading distinction between the person and the environment. In the first place, from a psychological point of view, the environment never causes behavior. It's the perception of the environment that causes behavior. It's the mental representation of the environment. And that mental representation is internal to the person. It's always a feature of the person. And even when we think about just plain old actions, actions tend to be intentional, and our intentions are also features of the person. So from a psychological viewpoint, correct attributions are always to the person. We always, as psychologists, explain a person's behavior in terms of his or her mental states of knowledge, feeling, and desire. And if that's the case, then the fundamental attribution error isn't an error, at least as far as psychologists are concerned. So now what do? Do we throw out 35, 40 years of research? Well, yes. But the other thing we do is to see if we can come up with a new framework for thinking about causal attribution. And that has been provided, I think, in large part by this same person, Bertrand Mallet, who has offered what he calls a folk conceptual theory of causal attribution. Mallet is not interested in what really causes behavior to occur. What he's interested in as a social psychologist is how people think about the causes of behavior, because it's how people think about the causes of behavior that are going to lead them to respond in various ways. So what he does is he abandons the model of the naive scientist that we basically picked up from Kelly, and tries instead to figure out how people actually reason about behavior. Instead of giving them little scenarios, right, about John laughing at the comedian and trying to figure out why John laughed at the comedian, he actually goes in and looks at real behaviors, real actions, and how people try to figure out the causes of those actions. Causes and reasons. The first part of Mallet's folk conceptual theory of causal attribution is a distinction between two kinds of generating factors. What he calls reasons, okay, which have to do with people's beliefs and feelings and desires, okay, and what he calls mere causes, which cause behavior to occur in a more or less mechanistic way, okay? Okay, so the first thing we have to do is to understand that causal attributions are going to differ depending on whether the behavior in question is intentional or unintentional. Mallet argues that intentional behavior, people explain intentional behavior in terms of reasons. You've got an action, and that is explained in terms of the person's beliefs and desires, values, knowledge, feeling, and desire, all that trilogy. So we can say, Anne studied for the test all night. Why did Anne study for the test all night? Anne studied for the test all night because she wanted to do well. There's an intentional action, and it is explained in terms of Anne's desire that she do well. When we explain intentional behavior in terms of reasons, there's an assumption of rationality, which is to say that there's a rational connection between what the person is doing and why he or she is doing it. Anne didn't study for the test all night because her dog was sick, okay? She studied for the test all night because she wanted to do well. There's also an assumption of subjectivity, which is to say that people are aware of the reasons for their behavior, okay? Unintentional behavior, however, gets explained in a very different way. It gets explained in terms of what Mallet calls mere causes, where there's no assumption of a rational connection between the behavior and the explanation of the behavior. Consider the following explanation. Anne was nervous about the test because she wanted to do well. Okay? There's no rational connection between the cause and its explanation. There's a mechanistic explanation. Okay? There's something about what wanting to do well that makes you nervous about your achievement or whatever, but it's not it doesn't have the same kind of status as the reason. She didn't say, "Oh, I want to do well, so I will be nervous about the test." It just happened. Okay, in a more or less mechanistic way. Okay, so now let's focus on intentional actions for a moment and look at the types of reasons that people give. And people usually give you some combination of a belief and a desire. Okay, now they don't always give you the whole thing. Okay, but if you think about Anne studying for the test, Anne studied for the test A, because she wanted to do well, and B, she believed that studying for the test would enable her to do well. There's a belief and a desire, and those kinds of states seem to be necessary for intentional actions to occur. Now, there's a trick here. And the trick is, well, it's not a dirty trick. It's just a subtlety. I shouldn't call it a trick, because there's no moral opprobrium attached to this. But these mental states can be marked or not marked in a linguistic sense. If I say to you, why did she go to the cafe? I say to you, she went to the cafe because she wanted an authentic cappuccino. The desire is marked by the predicate she wanted, okay? But, of course, that doesn't really explain why she went to the cafe. She may have wanted a cappuccino, but she also has to believe that the cafe serves cappuccino, okay? So the desire is marked, but the belief is unmarked. If I said to you, she went to the cafe because she thought they have authentic cappuccino, then the belief state is marked, and the desire state is unmarked. It's left implied. You wouldn't go to a cafe just because you thought they had authentic cappuccino. Okay? I don't go to cafes because I think they have authentic cappuccino, because I don't like cappuccino. Okay? I don't want cappuccino, so I don't go to those cafes for that reason. I go to them for some other reason. But here you've got the belief marked and the desire unmarked. Now, what's interesting is that sometimes when people give an explanation for their behavior, they can leave both the belief and the desire unmarked. Here's an example of this. She didn't speak up because the teacher was there. Somebody who doesn't understand that persons and environments are intertwined and interdependent might say, oh, look, that's a situational cause. The cause is, in the situation, the teacher is present or the teacher is absent, and speaking up co-varies with the presence or the absence of the teacher. See, they're explaining the behavior in terms of a situational cause. But if you think about it for a second, there is implied something else in a statement like this. She didn't speak up because the teacher was there and she didn't want to be overheard. She didn't speak up because the teacher was there and she didn't want the teacher to feel bad about her criticism, or whatever. There is a belief or a desire that is implicit in a statement like this. This looks like a situational explanation of behavior, but it's not really a situational explanation of behavior. Okay, so now we got these types of reasons that come in two basic forms, beliefs and desires. And we also have several different types of causes. And what's interesting about Mallet's analysis is that whereas reasons can apply only to the intentional actions of sentient beings, whether they're human beings or dogs or cats, doesn't matter, but you've got to have some kind of consciousness, causes, mere causes, can apply to any event, physical event, social event, behavioral event, or whatever. And here, Mallet picks up from Bernard Weiner at UCLA these three basic dimensions of causality: internal versus external causes, stable versus unstable causes, and global versus local causes. And just to show you that these kinds of causes that Weiner applies to the social case can be applied to the non-social case, consider the tree fell because the wind was strong. That's an external cause. The wind impinges on itself on the tree and makes it blow over. Contrast that with the tree fell because its roots were shallow. It's something about the tree that made it fall, not something about the environment in which the tree lives. Stable versus unstable causes. The tree fell because of a tornado. Well, tornadoes are things that thankfully happen only every once in a while. That's an unstable cause. The tree fell because the winds are strong here. That's a stable cause. That's a factor that's present all of the time. Finally, global versus local. The tree fell because the soil is bad here, okay? That's a kind of global cause. The soil is bad, okay? Or the tree fell because it was planted poorly. That's a local cause that applies only to that particular tree. So again, reasons apply only to intentional action, okay? These aren't reasons. There's a mechanical cause here. Mechanical causes can apply to unintentional behaviors as well as to events in the physical world. Okay, so we've got types of reasons applying to intentional action, types of causes applying to unintentional action, and then we've got a further aspect of causal attribution, which has to do with various kinds of enabling factors, of which Mallet talks about three. Skill, she got an A because she's pretty smart. Okay, so the fact that she's smart enables her to profit from her studying or whatever. Or opportunity, she got an A because her date was canceled. Okay, now you unpack that a little bit. Her date was canceled, so she had more time to study. Okay, but there was an opportunity that enabled her to get from belief and desire to the action. Or there's some obstacle that's removed. She got an A because she found her notes, which enabled her to study for the exam or whatever. Okay, so we got to distinguish between types of reasons, types of causes, enabling factors of various sorts. Notice that none of this has any representation in the covariation calculus. None of this has plays any role in kind of flat-footed statements about fundamental attribution errors and the naive scientist is a trait theorist and all this kind of stuff. Okay, reasons can have causal histories. We explain behavior in terms of, we explain intentional action in terms of the person's beliefs and desires, but we can also explain where the beliefs and desires came from. And again, whereas the connection between reasons and actions is characterized by subjectivity and by rationality, there is a rational connection between beliefs and desires, and you're aware of your beliefs and desires, presumably. There's no assumption of rationality in explaining where the beliefs and desires that come from. So, for example, if you're of a particular kind of person, like a Freudian or something like that, you might say that the reasons lie in some kind of unconscious process. He planted his garden because he loved his mother. Okay, in Freudian psychoanalysis, gardening is a symbol for sex. Okay, well, in Freudian psychoanalysis, everything's a symbol for sex, right? But this is one that Freud actually talks about. Or personality factors. He planted the garden because he's cheap. Okay, so he doesn't want to spend a lot of money, so then he decides to grow his own vegetables or whatever. But the fact that he's cheap and planted a garden, there's no rational connection between that. You could You could do lots of things because you're cheap. You could plant a garden for lots of different kinds of reasons. Or the causal antecedents might lie in socialization and culture. He planted the garden because he's a farm kid. Okay, so, you know, he likes to grow things. He likes vegetables around. Or he planted the garden because he likes fresh fruit. In the immediate context, maybe he can't get fresh fruit where he lives, so he decides to do it for that reason. Now, again, so reasons have their own histories, okay? And they might be interesting, and when we say, well, why did he have this belief? Why did he have this desire? We start talking about these kinds of factors. Okay, so putting it all together, what we get is a model like this for explaining intentional actions. We have the intentional act, okay? We explain that in terms of the individual's intention to, first, we assume that intentional acts are intended. That's the definition of an intentional act, right? And then there are reasons for having the intention, reasons that are found in the person's beliefs and desires. These reasons come from somewhere, so our causal model may include this causal history of reasons, but it doesn't have to. Okay, you can just say, well, he did it because he had certain beliefs and desires. And then there are certain enabling factors that intervene between the intention and the action. I may intend to study for the exam, but something may get in the way that may prevent me from doing that. But my intention has reasons behind it because I want to do well, I want to get into graduate school or whatever. These aspects in the left-hand side don't play any kind of role in unintentional action, okay? We don't give reasons for unintentional actions. Instead, we talk about mere causes, mechanical causes that lead to various kinds of unintended behavioral effects. Why did he blush? Because he was embarrassed, okay? When you're embarrassed, you tend to blush. You don't say, oh, I'm embarrassed, so I'm going to blush now, or anything like that, right? It just happens, right? Now, maybe you took a pill before you got embarrassed, and that prevented your blood pressure from doing what it would normally do, but this unintended behavior just has a kind of mere cause to it. So this, as you'll see, is an entirely different framework for thinking about causal attribution than the one that came to us from Kelly and that has, in one way or another, dominated social psychology and social cognition for actually now more than 40 years. It's a model that has very, very, very different kinds of predicates associated to it. And it turns out to be nicely complicated. Okay, so here's the whole. You want a calculus like the covariation calculus? Mallet gives you a flow chart for making causal attributions, a flow chart for explaining events in the social world. But as you'll see in a second, it looks very, very, very different from the covariation calculus or anything else that we've talked about so far. Okay, so the first thing you have to do is determine whether the behavioral event is intentional or not. Okay, is it an intentional action or is it an unintended behavior? If it's an unintended behavior, then you offer a cause for that behavior. The cause may lie external or internal, okay? And it may be external versus internal, it may be global versus local, it may be stable versus unstable or whatever, but that's what you do if it's intentional, if it's unintentional. If it's intentional, then what you have to do is to offer a reason, okay? Either in terms of the person's knowledge, belief, desire, or feeling, some kind of value the person has. Why did he go to college? Because he really likes to learn or something like that, all right? Not that he wants to learn or he believes he will learn anything in college, but because he likes to learn. So you can explain these behaviors in terms of values. These Beliefs and desires can be either marked or unmarked, that is, actually expressed in the reason or not. There may be enabling factors that get between the reason and the unintentional action. There may be a causal history to the reasons, but you only go through all of this to the extent that you do it at all for an intentional action. You don't do it for an unintentional action. Okay? So it's a very, very, very different framework for thinking about how people, do these kinds of things. There's nothing irrational about this. There's nothing illogical. The model of normative rationality doesn't really fit here one way or another, because what Mallet is trying to do is trying to figure out how people actually do it, instead of fitting our causal explanations into some kind of pre-existing the framework that makes a distinction between the person and the environment as fundamental. Mallet basically starts all over again by looking at the actual reasons that people give for various events in the social world. And he finds that when you do that, instead of asking people questionnaire items about John laughing at the comedian or something else that actually hasn't happened, or at least hasn't happened in your experience, you get a very, very different viewpoint. Skipping over this. So the big point for Mallet is that the study of social cognition is to a large degree a study of folk psychology. What we want to know is, how do people actually do it? How do people categorize the world? Not what categories exist out in the world, but how do people carve their world up into categories? How do people explain the events in that world? Not what really causes behavior. That's a job for other kinds of psychologists. But the job for social cognition is to try to figure out how people actually do it. And when we try to figure out how people actually do it, we discover that the traditional person-situation framework that was corrupted from Lewin, I think Lewin would have turned over in his grave if he knew that this had happened, is just not right. The person-situation framework is first inappropriate because if you think about it for a second, it treats all causes as if they were mere causes, as if there was simply a mechanistic example of the mechanistic connection between some factor of the person or some factor of the environment and some piece of behavior. Why did John smile? Because he's friendly. Why did John smile? Because she smiled at him. There's a mechanistic cause-effect relationship there, instead of why did John smile? Because he wanted to appear friendly to this person who looked like she was in trouble, or something else. That's a reason that has a rational connection between a person's intention and a person's behavior, okay? So the problem with the traditional framework is that it ignores reasons and beliefs. It ignores cognition. It ignores the things that go on in our heads that lead us to behave the way we do. And that is a big mistake. And that, finally, is the big mistake about the fundamental attribution error. Attributing behavior to a person's internal states and dispositions isn't an error. That's what we do as psychologists. That's what a psychological explanation is. And that is, in fact, fundamental to how we work as naive psychologists in the domain of social cognition. Okay, we'll see you Monday for the question and answer review session, and on Wednesday for the midterm. Thank you very much.